In this series, we'll be covering old Magic the Gathering cards and talking about their effect text, and why Magic effect text was infamously terrible back in the day. These range from just kind of strange to confusing to just straight up hilarious. And there's a lot to say about how the formatting of Magic cards has changed over the years. The first card we'll be covering is Unstable Mutation. Today, this is an aura enchantment for 1 blue with Enchant Creature. It is the ability where enchanted creature gets +3/+3. However, during each of your upkeeps, you have to put a -1/-1 counter on that creature. The original text of this card instead said, target creature gains +3/+3. Each round, put a -1/-1 counter on the creature during its controller's upkeep. These counters remain even if this enchantment is removed before the creature dies. We've already talked a lot about how these cards love to include extra clarification for rulings that they don't actually need, so we'll try not to dwell on that too much. The more interesting bit of wording is how it says each round you put a -1/-1 counter on the enchanted creature. The term round isn't in Magic's rules and generally isn't even used in common parlance. It's even more strange because the card's text later specifies that the counter is placed during its controller's upkeep. The clarification of each round does nothing to increase the legibility of the card. It's essentially worthless fluff, and as time went on, Magic would remove more and more of this kind of text from cards. This isn't the absolute worst example of wording in the early days of the game, but it is an example of the evolution of Magic's card text. Next up, we have a very interesting card, Oubliette. Instead of going over the current card's effects text, we're going to start by going over the original, as it's actually changed a lot over the years. The original Oubliette is an enchantment for 1 and 2 black with the ability, select a creature in play when Oubliette is cast. The creature is considered out of play as long as Oubliette is in play. Hence, the creature cannot be the target of spells and cannot receive damage, use special powers, attack, or defend. All counters and enchantments on the creature remain but are also out of play. If Oubliette is removed, creatures return to play tapped. Now, this card does have a lot of clarification, but for once, the clarification isn't as unnecessary as usual. At the time of Oubliette's printing, there weren't any cards that worked like it, and that remained the case for a very long time. There were cards like Parallax Wave pretty early on into the game that would exile or remove a card from the game for an amount of time and then return it to the field, but the rulings for these cards were very different. When you exiled a creature in this way, any enchantments and counters on it wouldn't be exiled with it. Instead, they all fell off as it changed zones. Oubliette was the only card for a very long time that allowed counters and enchantments to stay on a creature as it went to exile, and rather than change how it worked as the rules became more clear, Wizards wanted the card's original function to remain the same. As a result, the card received the following errata, which we can see in the Magic Online exclusive Masters Edition printing. It said, when Oubliette comes into play, remove target creature and all auras attached to it from the game. Note the number and kind of counters that were on that creature. When Oubliette leaves play, return the removed cards to play under its owner's control, tapped with the noted number and kinds of counters on it. If you do, return the removed aura cards to play under the owner's control attached to that permanent. This effect text is a bit archaic nowadays, using terms like play for the battlefield and not having exile keyworded yet, but it does explain how the card works perfectly. The only problem is that it's a mouthful to actually say. While preserving the original function of the card, it was a nightmare to read and explain to new players. There was a bit of controversy around the card though, as there was a way for Wizards to shorten the card's effects text by a lot, but it would change the card's functionality. They did end up going through with this change though, and we can see how the effect now reads on the Double Masters reprint. It now reads, when Oubliette enters the battlefield, target creature phases out until it leaves the battlefield. Tap the creature as it phases in this way. It also has some reminder text to explain exactly how phasing works. Now, phasing is ruled very different to blinking a creature, as the creature that phases out doesn't change zones. This allows the card to keep its auras and counters, and also phases those cards out just like the original text. But it does lead to new interactions with certain cards. For example, any card with an enters trigger, such as Inspiring Overseer, wouldn't trigger when Oubliette was removed anymore, despite the fact that they would have for most of Magic's history. This was actually kind of a big controversy when the card got reprinted. You see, Oubliette was actually a very important card for the Pauper format, and as it had not gotten a reprint before Double Masters since Arabian Nights in 1993, the card was ungodly expensive for a common in a side format. People really wanted the card to get reprinted, but Wizards didn't want to print the Masters Edition version with its terribly wordy card text. Phasing was far easier to understand and write, but changing the functionality of a card with an errata is something that Wizards tries to avoid as much as possible. It was eventually decided that clarity was more important than retaining functionality, but this is by no means an uncontroversial decision. Honestly, Oubliette is kind of a fascinating card. There are a ton of poorly written cards from back in the day, but so few of them have such an interesting story to tell. And of course, our next card, Rukh Egg, does also have a bit of an interesting story to go along with it. This is a 0/3 egg with a mana cost of 3 and 1 red. It currently has the ability where, whenever it dies, you create a 4/4 bird creature token with flying at the beginning of the next end step. Bit strange that it doesn't make the token right away, but whatever. However, the original text had a huge oversight. It read, if Rukh Egg goes to the graveyard, a Rukh, a 4/4 red flying creature, comes into play on your side at the end of that turn. Use a counter to represent Rukh. Rukh is treated exactly as a normal creature, except that if it leaves play, it is removed from the game entirely. Now, a lot of this is classic old wording, explaining extra rulings, and just sounds weird. However, you may have noticed that instead of saying, when this card is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, it just says, when Rukh Egg goes to the graveyard. This means you would get the token no matter how Rukh Egg ended up in the grave, regardless of where it came from. This allowed players to use cards like Bazaar Baghdad that could be tapped to let you draw 2 cards and then discard 3 cards to discard eggs and swarm the board with the Rukhs for basically no cost at all. This was fixed rather quickly, and the card received a functional errata before it was even reprinted much later in the 8th edition. This is one of the few times, alongside Oubliette, where the weird wording of an old card had gameplay implications. Before we move on, we should mention that the card uses the word counter to refer to a token yet again, adding to the confusion around the difference between tokens and counters. This confusion will get even worse with the next card we'll be covering. Cyclone is an enchantment for 2 and 2 green. It is the ability where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a win counter on Cyclone. Then you sacrifice Cyclone unless you pay 1 green for each counter on Cyclone. Then, if you paid, Cyclone deals damage equal to the number of counters on it to each creature and player. The original text for this card was, put 1 chip on Cyclone during your upkeep. Then pay 1 green for each chip or discard Cyclone. If not discarded, Cyclone immediately deals 1 damage per chip to each player and each creature in play. The main thing worth bringing up here is that we have found a card that decided to refer to counters by yet another different name. First counters, then tokens, and now chips. Adding to the confusion is the card Bottle of Solomon, which has a very long text box in its original printing. The notable thing is that it refers to the creature token it makes as a counter, despite that word is also being used to refer to the counters that Unstable Mutation uses. This confusion comes to a head with the card Tetravus in the next set, Antiquities. This is a 1/1 for 6 mana with flying. It enters with 3 +1/+1 counters. At the beginning of your upkeep, you can remove any number of +1/+1 counters to create that many 1/1 flying Tetrafied creature tokens, and they can't be enchanted. During your upkeep, you can also exile any number of these tokens you've created to put that many +1/+1 counters back on Tetravus. The original wording for the card said, flying, Tetravus gets 3 +1/+1 counters when cast during your upkeep. You may move these counters on or off of Tetravus. Counters move off of Tetravus become 1/1 flying artifact creatures. If such a creature dies, the counter is removed from play. Such creatures may not have enchantments played on them, and they do not share any enchantments with Tetravus. Here we have the end point of the confusion with counters and tokens, where a card refers to both +1/+1 counters and token creatures as the exact same thing. In fact, they don't even acknowledge that the counters moved off of Tetravus have undergone a radical transformation in terms of what they are. They just say the counters not on Tetravus are creatures, like they're the exact same objects as before the ability resolved. Again, like we mentioned earlier, creatures and tokens are entirely different categories of game objects, and referring to them as the same thing is really confusing as to what kind of effects would interact with them. It was really inevitable that these kinds of cards would receive an errata later down the line to at the very least make the game internally consistent with what the words on the cards meant. We're done with Arabian Nights in terms of cards with bad rule text, so we'll be moving on to Antiquities. The first card mentioned here is Martyrs of Korlis. This is a 1/6 human with a mana cost of 3 and 2 white. It now has the ability where any damage you would take from artifacts while it's untapped is dealt to the Martyrs instead. Its original printing instead said, unless Martyrs is tapped, any damage done to you by artifacts is instead applied to Martyrs of Korlis. You may not take this damage yourself, but you may prevent this damage if possible. No more than 1 bodyguard of your choice can take damage for you in this manner each turn. A lot of over-explaining here, but the final sentence of this card's effects is just strange. I have no idea what it's trying to communicate here, unless there's been a rules change that isn't easily accessible. There is no line of text on the Oracle's versions of this card that has any sort of restriction about the number of times you can redirect damage via these sorts of effects. Heck, you can redirect the damage to multiple different copies of Martyrs specifically if you have more than one in the field, untapped at the same time. It's almost like Wizards just forgot that line of text on the card completely. This is one of the few times where I can't even figure out what they were trying to get across with that text of one of these cards, or at least figure out what happened between the original print and the current version. Reconstruction has a weird bit of wording in its first printing. This is a sorcery for 1 blue that returns target artifact from your graveyard to your hand. However, the Antiquities version instead said, bring 1 artifact from your graveyard to your hand. While not confusing, the text is strange considering that cards like Raise Dead were in the first set of Magic and weren't worded this way. Raise Dead just said, return creature from graveyard to your hand. Not that different to what it says now. This inconsistency is strange, but not necessarily bad. The creators may have simply wanted more variety in the text on their cards, but variety isn't a virtue when it comes to card text. Consistency is. The more consistent the card text is, the easier time players will have understanding the cards and rulings. Some cards that did have really bad text back in the day were Sage of Lat Nam, Priest of Yawgmoth, and Dwarven Weaponsmith. Now, these cards have relatively simple effect text. The easiest to talk about is Sage. This is a 1/2 for 1 and 1 blue with the effect where you can tap it and sacrifice an artifact to draw a card. However, the term sacrifice was not keyworded for a very long time. Not at the time of Antiquities. So all 3 of these cards that sacrifice cards had horrible text boxes. Instead of this effective 7-word text box, Sage originally said, tap to draw a card from your library. Each time you use this ability, you must choose one of your artifacts in play and place it in the graveyard. This artifact cannot be the one that is already in its way to the graveyard, and artifact creatures killed this way cannot be regenerated. These cards really show the power of keywording. The term sacrifice is not confusing to any player, and the ruling that the cards that you sacrifice can't be regenerated is simple and easy for most players to remember once they learn it. Simply learning the keyword and their associated ruling is far less confusing than having cards like Sage in the game that have such bloated text boxes to explain very simple effects. Even outside of being terribly confusing, it's also very funny that Sage specifies that you draw a card from your library, as opposed to drawing a card from your opponent's library. Priest and Weaponsmith also talk about sacrificing in this terrible and convoluted way for absolutely no reason. However, there was one card that did use the word sacrifice in this set, Gate to Phyrexia. Its original text was, sacrifice one of your creatures during your upkeep to destroy any one artifact. You may not sacrifice a creature that is already on its way to the graveyard. Now, this wasn't a keyword at the time, so the term sacrifice didn't actually hold any meaning outside of the standard meaning of the word in English. It's just funny to see many cards failing to describe this action only for Gate of Phyrexia to waltz in and basically nail it on its first try. Transmute Artifact is a card with an admittedly complex effect, which means that it having good rules text is even more important. This is a sorcery for 2 blue with the following effect. You sacrifice an artifact, then tutor out an artifact from your library. If it costs the same amount or less than the artifact you sacrifice, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, you may pay X, where X is the difference between the cost of the artifact you sacrifice and the artifact you found. If you do, put it onto the battlefield. If you don't, it gets put into your graveyard. Nowadays, they would have worded this card a lot differently. But this text is to mimic the function of the original card's text, which is even more cumbersome. Transmute originally said, search through your library for 1 artifact card and immediately place it into play. Also, choose an artifact in play that you control and place it into its owner's graveyard. If the new artifact has a casting cost greater than that of the discarded one, you must pay the difference or Transmute Artifact fails and both artifacts are discarded. Shuffle your library after playing this card. Now, the wording of this card leaves a lot to be desired, of course. It's overly wordy, thanks in part to sacrifice not being keyworded. In fact, it's so long that the clarifications they had to put up with on the other sacrifice cards couldn't even fit here. The best part of the effect is probably where it says that if you can't pay the difference, then Transmute Artifact fails, which is maybe the only time a card has had a failure condition in its effect. Honestly, the fact that even this cleaned up version of the effect text is a mess is why they don't print cards like this. It could have just had a restriction where you could only find cards that cost the same amount or less off of its effect, or let you pay mana up front and tutor for something with a mana value equal to what you paid, plus the cost of whatever you sacrifice, but that would make too much sense. Instead, it first lets you tutor out the card, then you have to do mana and make the payment while the card is resolving. After a few nightmare cards like this slip through, Wizards decided to design their cards to be more straightforward to resolve, with less extra clauses about if you do something weird while casting the spell, and more restrictions to stop you from doing those things. In a sense, this card influenced future designs thanks to just how terrible it was, which is pretty neat. Next, we have another weird card, Goblin Artisans. We'll start with the original text of the card this time. This is a 1/1 Goblin Artificer for 1 red with the following original ability. You may tap Goblin Artisans as you cast an artifact, then flip a coin. Opponent calls heads or tails while the coin is in the air. If the flip ends up in opponent's favor, your artifact is countered. Otherwise, draw a card from your library. You can only use this ability once for each time you cast an artifact. The way they write the coin flip effect here is a little clunky, as we'll see pretty soon. However, the interesting part is the final line of text. You may think, well, of course you can only use it once. You have to tap it to use the ability. However, that's not what Goblin Artisans means. The restriction means that you can only target an artifact with a single version of Goblin Artisan's ability ever, regardless of where the ability came from. The revamped version of the ability simplifies it too. Tap, flip a coin. If you win the flip, draw a card. If you lose the flip, counter target artifact spell you control that isn't the target of an ability from another creature named Goblin Artisans. The reason for this is probably to stop a player from double or triple dipping on an artifact spell being cast to try and draw multiple cards. Overall, they just wanted to make sure you actually had to gamble with this card. Still, the card is very different from almost anything else in the game. Unlike a lot of the other card games, Magic doesn't dip into the design space of not being able to use the abilities of a card with a specific name multiple times, something that both the other big 3 card games have done. Funnily enough, thanks to caring about the names of the card, you can get 2 copies of the ability by abusing a card like Sakashimi the Imposter, which becomes a copy of a creature but keeps its old name. So, if you want to, you can pull off the impressive combo of having 2 50% chances to draw a card when you cast an artifact. Artisans is honestly less of a poorly written card and more of just a weird card, but it was unique enough that it was hard to ignore. And finally, we have Obelisk of Undoing. This is an artifact for 1 mana with the ability where you can pay 6 and tap it to return target permanent you both own and control to your hand. The original text instead said, return any of your permanents in play to your hand. Enchantments on the permanents are discarded. Can only be used on cards you cast. This wording is extremely strange, because it changes the effect of the card in a pretty big way. There are a lot of situations where you can get a permanent onto the battlefield that you own without casting it. For one, any land you play isn't cast, but under this wording, you shouldn't be able to bounce them. This would also mean you can't bounce any tokens you made or any cards cheated out with a card like Eureka. And tokens were around this early on in Magic, as we've seen. This is also a card that doesn't use the word target for an ability that does target, but in this case, it may be the worst we've seen yet. The wording, return any of your permanents, isn't necessarily clear that it can only target 1 permanent back to your hand. Even older cards back in the day would usually say something like destroy any one land in the case of Stone Rain. Overall, just a lot of strange wording decisions on this card that make it less clear what the effect actually is. Anyway, that's all the weird cards in Arabian Nights and Antiquities. Overall, they were much better than Alpha was, but there are still a lot of cards that were written in confusing and all-around strange ways. The game slowly got better about things like this, and watching how things changed is honestly interesting in of itself.